Picture this, a cozy diner, a jukebox humming in the corner, a leather-jacketed cool guy snapping his fingers, and a wholesome American family navigating the innocent chaos of 1950s Milwaukee. For 11 glorious seasons, Happy Days sold America a dream, a warm, fuzzy postcard from a simpler time. Millions of families gathered around their television sets every week, laughing along with the Cunninghams, swooning over the Fonz, and believing wholeheartedly in the magic of Arnold's Drive-In. But here's the truth nobody told you. Behind every perfectly combed hairstyle and every gleaming chrome bumper, Happy Days was hiding secrets that would make your jaw drop. The star of the show couldn't ride a motorcycle. The network tried to ban the most iconic jacket in television history. A character vanished into thin air without a single goodbye. And one particular water skiing stunt permanently changed the vocabulary of pop culture forever. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 20 secrets about Happy Days that were buried for decades. And trust me, by the time we reach the bonus fact at the end, you'll never look at this beloved classic the same way again. Before Happy Days became a television institution, it barely existed at all. In 1972, producer Gary Marshall was working on a romantic anthology series called Love, American Style, and he needed a short segment to fill a gap in the programming. So he created a small nostalgic piece called Love and the Happy Days, featuring a young Ron Howard and Anson Williams as teenagers bumbling through sock hops and first dates in 1950s Milwaukee. The segment ran once, received a polite response from audiences, and then quietly disappeared into the television archives. Nobody thought much of it. Nobody championed it. It was filler, pleasant, harmless, and completely forgettable. Then, 2 years later, something unexpected happened. George Lucas released American Graffiti, a film soaked in 1950s nostalgia, and audiences absolutely devoured it. Studio executives suddenly realized there was a massive, untapped hunger for the aesthetic of poodle skirts, drive-ins, and rock and roll innocence. ABC remembered that little throwaway sketch Marshall had produced. They called him with a simple question: could he turn it into a full series? Marshall said yes, and what had once been a 15-minute afterthought slowly transformed into one of the most beloved and longest-running sitcoms in American broadcast history. When ABC greenlit the series, the casting process for Richie Cunningham was surprisingly competitive. Network executives wanted a completely unknown face, someone fresh, someone audiences had no prior association with. They held extensive auditions, screen-tested dozens of young actors, and searched far and wide for their perfect all-American boy. Nobody clicked. Nobody had that magical combination of sincerity, warmth, and relatability that the role demanded. It was only after weeks of frustrating auditions that someone remembered Ron Howard from that old Love, American Style segment. Howard had been working steadily since childhood, most notably on The Andy Griffith Show, but he had never quite broken through into stardom. He was reliable, likable, and familiar, but not a headline name. Marshall brought him in not for a formal audition, but simply for a conversation. Within minutes, the decision was made. Howard radiated an effortless, genuine quality that no amount of acting training could manufacture. He wasn't performing the role of Richie Cunningham. He simply was Richie Cunningham, sitting right there in the room. The part was his before he ever read a single line of the script. When Gary Marshall first developed Happy Days, Arthur Fonzarelli was written as a minor background character, a local tough guy who would drift in and out of episodes, add a little edge to the wholesome proceedings, and then disappear. Henry Winkler auditioned with a slicked-back hairstyle and the quiet menace of someone who understood precisely how dangerous charm could be. Marshall was immediately captivated, but ABC executives were deeply uncomfortable. They felt the character was too rebellious, too threatening for a family-friendly program. Their official mandate was clear: the Fonz could appear in no more than 2 episodes. Marshall nodded, agreed on paper, and then proceeded to quietly ignore everything they said. He kept writing Fonzie into scripts, kept giving him meatier scenes and sharper dialogue. When viewer letters began flooding the network, thousands of fans demanding more of this magnetic, leather-clad mechanic, ABC had no practical choice but to relent. By the second season, Winkler's name appeared in the opening credits. By the third, he was unquestionably the biggest star on the entire show, having transformed a 2-episode guest role into one of the most iconic characters in the history of American television. Here is perhaps the most delicious irony in Happy Days history. The Fonz was defined by his motorcycle. It was his throne, his symbol, the physical embodiment of his effortless cool. And Henry Winkler, the man who brought him to life, was genuinely terrified of motorcycles. He had never ridden one before being cast on the show, and when the production attempted to teach him, the results were, by all accounts, spectacularly unsuccessful. His balance was unreliable. He stalled the engine repeatedly. On one particularly memorable occasion, he nearly toppled the entire bike sideways in front of the full production crew. The solution the show arrived at was elegantly simple. Most of the time, the motorcycle simply wasn't running. Winkler would stride over to the bike, swing his leg over the seat with maximum confidence, deliver his lines, kick up the stand, and walk away. Whenever the motorcycle actually needed to move, a stunt double quietly handled the riding, or crew members pushed the bike just outside the camera's frame. The man who made motorcycle culture cool for an entire generation of American children never actually learned to operate one. Sometimes the greatest illusions are built on the smallest practical concessions. The Fonz's leather jacket is one of the most recognizable pieces of clothing in television history. It currently sits in the Smithsonian Institution. But in the early days of Happy Days, ABC fought with every weapon at their disposal to keep that jacket off the screen. Network executives in the early 1970s associated leather jackets exclusively with gang culture, juvenile delinquency, and social rebellion, none of which they considered appropriate imagery for a family sitcom airing in prime time. They issued Gary Marshall a direct order: absolutely no leather, ever. Fonzie would have to wear something softer, something safer, something that communicated toughness without suggesting actual danger. Marshall pushed back hard, but the network refused to budge. So he found a loophole of breathtaking simplicity. He argued that if Fonzie was standing near his motorcycle, the leather jacket was technically safety equipment, protective riding gear rather than a fashion statement. The network, somewhat reluctantly, accepted this logic. Marshall then proceeded to ensure that every single Fonzie scene was staged in proximity to that motorcycle, even when it made absolutely no narrative sense whatsoever to have a motorcycle parked inside a living room. Slowly, episode by episode, the jacket became so deeply woven into the cultural fabric of the show that ABC quietly abandoned their objections entirely. The double thumbs up, accompanied by that signature IE, became Fonzie's calling card, plastered on lunchboxes, posters, t-shirts, and notebooks across America. But it was never written in any script, never choreographed by any director, and never planned by anyone involved in the production. It was born from a moment of pure, unscripted panic. During an early rehearsal, Winkler found himself stumbling over a particularly tricky line. He couldn't find the right delivery, kept losing the rhythm of the words, and finally, in sheer frustration, thrust both thumbs into the air and made a noise. The crew erupted in laughter. Gary Marshall immediately told him to do exactly that on camera. The studio audience's reaction was electric. Marshall recognized lightning in a bottle and instructed the writing team to begin incorporating the gesture into future scripts. Within weeks, it had become the defining signature of the most popular character on television. Fonzie's accidental improvisation became bigger than the show itself, seeping into everyday American culture and remaining there for decades. The most iconic moment in Happy Days history happened because an actor forgot his lines. Marion Ross portrayed Marion Cunningham with such warmth and maternal grace that it became genuinely impossible to imagine anyone else in the role. But for the first 2 seasons of the show, Ross herself was convinced her days were numbered. She was not a major name when she was cast, had compiled a respectable but unremarkable resume of small television roles, and knew perfectly well that the network had reservations about her star power. During the rocky first season, when ratings were inconsistent and the show's identity was still forming, Ross reportedly asked Gary Marshall the same anxious question on a weekly basis. Was she about to be replaced? Marshall always reassured her, but she remained unconvinced. She kept her performances deliberately understated, terrified that drawing too much attention to herself might accelerate her dismissal. Then the fan mail began mentioning Mrs. C by name. Critics singled out her warmth specifically. Ratings improved, and Ross finally allowed herself to exhale. By the third season, she was not merely employed. She was beloved, having created one of the warmest and most enduring maternal figures in the history of the medium. Tom Bosley's portrayal of Howard Cunningham became synonymous with decent, steady, reassuring fatherhood. But after the first season wrapped, Bosley was seriously contemplating whether to return at all. He was a Tony Award-winning stage actor who had devoted his career to the rigorous craft of live theater. The rhythms of sitcom production felt mechanical and repetitive to him, fundamentally beneath his artistic training and ambitions. He told his agent he wasn't sure the show was the right place for him. Gary Marshall responded not with a bigger paycheck or contractual incentives, but with a single, direct question. Did Bosley want to be part of something that genuinely mattered to people? Marshall laid out his vision for Howard Cunningham, not as a generic TV dad, but as a symbol of stability, decency, and quiet moral strength that American families desperately needed during the turbulent 1970s. Bosley sat with that conversation for a week. Then he signed on for season 2 and stayed for all 11 seasons, ultimately creating one of television's most respected paternal figures. One honest conversation changed the entire trajectory of the show. Erin Moran was just 13 years old when she was cast as Joni Cunningham, and over the following 11 years, the Happy Days set became the primary landscape of her entire childhood and adolescence. She experienced puberty under studio lighting. She navigated her first romantic feelings surrounded by camera operators and script supervisors. She learned to drive in the studio parking lot. Every awkward, painful, tender stage of growing up was captured on film and broadcast to millions of living rooms across America. Moran later spoke candidly about the enormous psychological pressure this created, the strange blurring of boundaries between Joni's scripted teenage struggles and her own real-life experiences happening simultaneously. When Happy Days finally ended in 1984, she was 23 years old and had spent nearly half her entire life on that set. The show was not merely a job for her. It was her childhood, documented and distributed nationally, with all of its confusion and beauty permanently preserved on videotape. Happy Days premiered in January 1974 to a reception that can most generously be described as lukewarm. Critics categorized it as pleasant but insubstantial nostalgia. Ratings were mediocre. By the time the first season concluded, ABC executives were actively discussing cancellation and redirecting resources toward more promising projects. Gary Marshall lobbied passionately for a second season, arguing that the show simply hadn't yet found its footing or its audience. The network agreed, but barely, and with significantly reduced budget and promotional support attached. If Season 2 didn't demonstrate measurable improvement, the series was finished. Marshall responded by making bold changes, dramatically increasing Fonzie's screen time, sharpening the comedy, and trusting the ensemble more fully. The gamble paid off. By mid-season 2, ratings were climbing steadily. By the season finale, Happy Days had become a genuine hit. The show that nearly disappeared after 12 episodes went on to run for 11 seasons and spawn multiple spin-offs. Sometimes the greatest success stories begin inches away from cancellation. In the 5th season, the show sent its characters to Hollywood, where Fonzie, still wearing his leather jacket, strapped on water skis and literally leaped over a caged shark. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than an entertainingly absurd stunt in a light comedy series. Then, years later, radio personality John Hine coined the phrase, "jumping the shark," to describe the precise moment any television series exhausts its creative ideas and begins its irreversible decline. He pointed to that specific Happy Days episode as his defining example. The phrase spread through popular culture with astonishing speed and permanence, eventually entering mainstream dictionaries and everyday conversation. The great irony is that Happy Days actually continued for 6 more successful seasons after the famous shark episode, maintaining solid ratings throughout. The show didn't decline, but the phrase stuck regardless, turning a single silly stunt into television's most enduring metaphor for creative desperation. During the first 2 seasons, Richie and Joni Cunningham had an older brother named Chuck, a basketball-playing, popular, all-American older sibling played by 2 different actors across those early episodes. Then, between seasons 2 and 3, Chuck vanished. There was no farewell episode. No explanation. No acknowledgement of any kind. The Cunningham family simply contracted from 3 children to 2, and nobody on screen ever uttered Chuck's name again for the remainder of the series. Gary Marshall eventually confirmed what everyone suspected. The character wasn't generating interesting stories, the writers had exhausted their ideas for him, and rather than crafting a proper exit, the production simply erased him from existence. Audiences noticed immediately, and the mystery of Chuck's disappearance became one of television's most discussed continuity oddities. TV tropes eventually immortalized the phenomenon by naming it Chuck Cunningham syndrome, a term now used broadly to describe any character who disappears from a series without explanation or acknowledgement. Every week, while audiences watched Fonzie project supreme, unshakable confidence, Henry Winkler was privately waging an exhausting war against the printed page. Winkler has severe dyslexia, but he wasn't formally diagnosed until he was 31 years old, years deep into playing the Fonz. Before his diagnosis, he simply assumed he was intellectually inferior to his peers, a belief that caused him tremendous private suffering. Memorizing scripts required extraordinary effort. While fellow cast members could glance at a few pages and absorb the dialogue quickly, Winkler spent entire nights wrestling with the same 3 pages, reading them repeatedly until the words finally held still long enough to stick. He developed elaborate coping strategies, asking others to read scenes aloud, rehearsing obsessively with cast members, and improvising confidently whenever his memory failed him. That improvisation, born entirely from necessity, produced some of the Fonz's most beloved moments. Decades after the show ended, Winkler went public with his story and became a tireless advocate for children with learning disabilities, proving that the coolest guy on television had been quietly fighting an invisible battle the entire time. On screen, Richie Cunningham and Fonzie shared a warm, brotherly friendship that felt entirely authentic. Off-screen, the relationship between their portrayers became strained to the point of near silence. The tension was never rooted in personal animosity, but in something more complex and painful, the gradual shifting of the show's center of gravity away from Howard and toward Winkler. Howard had been the unambiguous star, the name above the title, the heart of the series. Then Fonzie exploded into a cultural phenomenon, and suddenly the show was being rebuilt around Winkler. Episodes that once centered on Richie were restructured to feature Fonzie. Howard found himself increasingly pushed to the margins of a show he had anchored from the beginning. The 2 men remained scrupulously professional during production but stopped socializing entirely. No lunches together, no phone calls, no friendship outside the soundstage. It wasn't until years after the series concluded that they finally addressed the distance honestly. Both apologized. Today they describe each other as genuine friends. But during Happy Days' peak years, the 2 biggest stars on the show were essentially strangers. By the 7th season, Ron Howard had made his decision. He was leaving the show to pursue a directing career. He informed Gary Marshall, who faced the daunting challenge of replacing the character who had been the emotional anchor of Happy Days since its very first episode. Marshall's strategy was to introduce younger energy through a new character, Chachi Arcola, Fonzie's younger cousin, played by a 17-year-old Scott Baio. The plan was to slowly transition the show's focus from Richie to Chachi, using Baio's chemistry with Erin Moran's Joni as the new romantic and comedic engine of the series. Chachi became popular, but not popular enough to carry the full weight of a lead role. Marshall eventually gave the 2 characters their own spin-off, Joni Loves Chachi, which lasted precisely 1 season before cancellation. Happy Days continued without Richie, leaning heavily on Fonzie and the supporting ensemble, and survived, but the creative spark was noticeably diminished. Some vacancies simply cannot be filled. For the first 2 seasons, the gang's central gathering place was Arnold's Drive-In, presided over by the lovably grumpy Arnold, played by Pat Morita. Then Morita departed to star in a Happy Days spin-off, and the production needed a replacement immediately. Enter Al Del Vecchio, played by Al Molinaro, a gentle, slightly awkward man who simply appeared behind the counter one episode with no explanation whatsoever provided to the audience. Arnold had not sold the diner on screen. There was no transition storyline, no farewell moment, no handover scene. A new man was simply running the restaurant, and the show proceeded as though nothing unusual had occurred. Audiences accepted the change with remarkable ease, embraced Molinaro's Al as warmly as they had Morita's Arnold, and the diner continued serving its essential narrative function. Pat Morita, meanwhile, went on to achieve genuine cinematic immortality as Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid. Both men thrived. The burgers kept coming regardless of who was cooking them. Among the most memorable recurring locations in Happy Days was Fonzie's personal office at the garage, a private space where he dispensed wisdom, conducted his various enterprises, and maintained his carefully cultivated mystique. Observant viewers who looked closely at the set might have noticed something slightly incongruous on the wall, a urinal. That was not a set designer's quirky creative choice. Fonzie's iconic office was a converted men's restroom. The production simply lacked the budget and available studio space to construct a purpose-built office set, so the art department repurposed an existing bathroom, strategically concealing the plumbing fixtures behind motorcycle posters and automotive equipment. Most viewers never noticed, and those who did generally assumed it was an intentional character detail. Naturally, the Fonz would commandeer a bathroom and make it his own. In reality, it was pure economic necessity disguised as personality. Budget constraints accidentally created one of the most memorable rooms in 1970s television. The theme song most people associate instantly with Happy Days, that bouncy, irresistible rock anthem by Pratt and McLean, with its Sunday, Monday, Happy Days chorus, was not the original opening music. For its first 2 seasons, the show used Bill Haley and his Comets' Rock Around the Clock, a genuine 1950s classic that established the nostalgic atmosphere perfectly but came with expensive licensing costs. When the network decided they wanted to own their theme music outright, Marshall commissioned an original song, and the Pratt and McLean version debuted in Season 3, quickly becoming iconic in its own right. It charted on the Billboard Hot 100 and became one of the most recognized theme songs in television history. Adding further complexity, later syndication and streaming releases sometimes reverted to Rock Around the Clock due to ongoing licensing disputes, meaning different versions of the same episodes have circulated with different opening music. A slower instrumental variation was also used in certain international markets. The show's opening was considerably less stable than most fans have ever realized. Happy Days was produced entirely during the 1970s while being set entirely in the 1950s,